Does Nvidia's GeForce Now signal a new era in gaming?
And how do we ever live without Google Maps? Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by Casa Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market. Welcome to Vertical Hold, behind the tech news, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined, as usual, by a man who remembers when BlackBerry phones were cool, Alex Kidman. Now, I was more of a Palm Trio guy myself, but Alex, were you a Crackberry addict back in the day?
Well, look, back in the day, I had a crackberry on one hip and an onion on the other, as was the style at the
Style at the
time.
time.
But yeah, it's not coincidental that you mentioned BlackBerry because they're back in the headlines this week, but not in the best way. So for the past couple of years, you could buy BlackBerry phones, but they weren't actually being made by BlackBerry, the company formerly known as Research in Motion. They were actually being produced by TCL, or largely worldwide, they were being produced by TCL, the company behind obviously the TCL TVs and the newer TCL phones, but also Alcatel.
Yeah.
And this week, uh, BlackBerry and TCL basically announced that their partnership was coming to an end as of the end of August. TCL Communication won't have the rights to design or manufacture new BlackBerry models. Now, that's not a huge shock. It's been a fair while since they actually released a new one anyway. And it almost certainly means that at this year's Mobile World Congress, they won't be trotting out a brand new, fresh BlackBerry model. But what it really signifies, globally speaking, there are some exceptions to this, but globally speaking, it's probably the end of BlackBerry hardware at all. I can't see any other company picking up the ball and going, you know what the world really needs right now is a phone with a keyboard on it.
But this isn't really a surprise when you look at it because this is like the business equivalent of what happened to Nokia in the consumer phone space, right? Before the iPhone, BlackBerry and Nokia were too big to fail. They were the giants, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs actually said they were taking on BlackBerry with the original iPhone.
And people probably laughed at him.
Yeah.
Not laughing now, are they?
Well,
So
no,
who
they're
would
not.
want a BlackBerry? Like, what have they been selling in the last couple of years? Who would even think about a BlackBerry these days?
Well, look, there is still an enthusiast market for them. I went to TCL's BlackBerry launch at Mobile World Congress a few years back, thinking, okay, well, this could be a little bit interesting. And there was a really passionate crowd, not just the usual cynical journalist types like myself. There's a really passionate crowd of people there who are really excited to see new BlackBerry hardware. But they did have this problem that obviously the licensing costs from BlackBerry, the company, added to the cost of the phone.
Yeah.
And what they ended up selling was kind of high mid range and sometimes even punching into premium priced phones for what were definitely mid range hardware. And you combine that with the fact that as soon as you slap a physical keyboard onto a phone, you've got to have a smaller screen. And in this day and age, that means it's less suitable for video watching. The cameras were okay for mid range for their time, but never exceptional. You were basically paying a lot for that physical keyboard, and it made it a very, very hard sell. But I did mention that it's not quite the end of the road in certain markets because while TCL held a worldwide license, it wasn't actually exclusive. There were separate mobs who held licenses for Indonesia and then the Indian market, and they produced their own completely different Blackberries, but only for domestic consumption, as it was.
Yeah.
I've not seen anything to indicate they'll stop making them. So
And
clearly,
they
the
are big
brand's still got
markets.
some legs.
Yeah, they are big markets. So the BlackBerry handsets are running Android, yes?
The new ones are, yes,
Yeah.
they're not like the Blackberries of old, which were running on
Yeah.
their own OS.
Yeah. And so I guess when you're competing with Android, you're competing with the high-end Android experiences from the other handsets. So it makes it harder to say, go with us.
Yeah, look, their big play in the Android space was that they were producing hardened enterprise grade security Android. They would say, right,
Yeah.
you're actually using BlackBerry services. And I should point out, I suppose, BlackBerry itself, the company still exists. They've got a bunch of software services. They hold a bunch of valuable patents. The company is still around and presumably will be for some time because they have those business functions. The phones were always meant, I guess, to serve those business functions. And whilst it's a bit sad to kind of see the hardware going away, realistically, it was always the software that was the big thing for
The
BlackBerry.
security. Yeah.
But not just the security. Back in the day, BlackBerry was really quite innovative because their big thing, of course, was messaging and especially email, because they were pushing really fast, really good email to your phone. But this was in an era when most of us were on 2G networks. And
Hmm.
if you tried to hook up an iPhone to a 2G network and get your email, you'd be waiting a while.
Yeah, and that's what sort of the iPhone tapped into though. Before iPhones came along, the cool kids actually had Blackberries, as hard as that's to believe, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. They were the iPhones of their time. They were
Yeah.
definitely the business desirable, but they also had a certain kind of cool factor to them. And so you even saw companies like Samsung for a while produced a BlackBerry style phone, a phone with a physical keyboard. It wasn't as good as the BlackBerry keyboard, it wasn't as
Yeah.
robust, but there were clones of that kind of idea. And that continued on even into kind of the early iPhone history. But for the past few years, it's been shrinking market and shrinking market. And like I said, I don't see anyone picking up the license. I think, globally speaking, this is the end of the road for the BlackBerry.
So, Alex, you've slopped on some sunscreen, slapped on a hat, and snuck out of the Vertical Hold studios this week to catch up with a few of our regular guests. Who have you been talking to behind my back?
So, look, you know I love talking to people called Alex. We're the best and brightest in the tech journalist community, and I say that without a hint of bias. So, first of all, I caught up with Alex Walker, the editor of Kotaku Australia, because Nvidia finally brought their GeForce Now product out of beta and into full commercial release. Here's my chat with him. So I'm chatting to Alex Walker from Kotaku Australia, and one of the big pieces of gaming news this week was that after a period in beta which possibly would have put Google to shame, Nvidia's pushed its GeForce Now service from beta to live. It's now a commercial product. But Alex, what is GeForce Now in a nutshell?
So GeForce Now has been effectively NVIDIA's way to stream the games that you already own through to, say, another device. So originally it was just a case of, okay, you can stream your Steam library, for instance, because, there is, NVIDIA has like a separate game library, which I'll cover in a sec. But effectively, you could, if you had, say, something like The Witcher on Steam, then you could then stream that through to your phone, or say, like, more likely like a MacBook or some low-powered laptop that wouldn't be able to play like a super high-end ray traced game while you're woodworking or something like that.
So in its commercial form, it's got free and paid. The free is not terrible, I guess, if you're getting a 1080p PC out of it, but it's only an hour at a time, isn't it?
Yes. So it allows you to access like what you have without having to, pay any extra, which is actually like a really good deal because you've already paid for the games in the first place. You're not getting GeForce Now is not giving you a rotating library in the way that the Stadia Pro subscription would be, or even other subscriptions, say like Xbox Game Pass or something like PlayStation Plus. So that 1 hour limit is, I wouldn't say generous, but it works really well if you're the kind of person who is just looking to play something when you're traveling in a hotel for a work trip or something like that. And it's also a very good way of getting people into the GeForce ecosystem because the NVIDIA's game streaming alternatives, they've got GeForce Now. They've also got Game Stream, which is kind of another venture that they've had going for a while, which is built in as part of the GeForce Experience middleware whenever you download a driver, or if you're downloading a driver through GeForce Experience. Game Stream is sort of bundled in within all of those options. So, they've had a few things for a while I think, since about 2013. And part of the problem I've had is it's kind of always been a little bit convoluted. So GeForce Now launching and having a free option at least gets people to understand without having to pay anything up front, which is a good result for NVIDIA.
So if I do pay Nvidia money, what do I get out of that if they're not actually selling games?
So in your case, in my case, paying NVIDIA money will get you nothing because GeForce Now isn't actually available in Australia. So it's kind of one of the problems that, and this is similar to PlayStation as well, like their service isn't available in Australia. A lot of the streaming services aren't available here at all, even Project X Cloud, which is like Xbox's streaming offering, that hasn't officially come to Australia yet. It's only, in testing overseas. And the reason for that is because it relies off NVIDIA data centers. and they have data centers in the US, Europe, and some in Asia. But unfortunately, they don't have one in Australia, and they're not going to, tack on to say Google Cloud or AWS or Azure or something like that. So there's no option for Australians to enjoy GeForce Now, whether it is, the paid or the free version.
So does that preclude someone being particularly keen on this idea and VPNing?
If you were to VPN, you basically have two options. You would be VPNing into Korea or into Japan, because those are those are the two closest locations to Australia in terms of Nvidia data centers. So you could go that route. Probably start with VPN into the US to set up the transactions and all the rest of it, and then just log into the Korean CDN. You're already adding a significant amount of latency, adding the latency from the VPN, and then the extra latency of going to at best 120, 110, 120 if you're going to South Korea or Japan servers, and then on top of the input lag on the other side when the data comes back, it's going to make a lot of games pretty unplayable. So I'm not sure that it would actually be worth anyone's time, to be frank. I think there's better options.
If only we had some kind of robust national network of broadband services out there, but that's obviously a dream for another day. So you mentioned alternatives for Australians if we can't get into this. What are they?
So the most likely alternative coming up is going to be Microsoft's Project Extra. That should open up testing fairly soon. They've already done a fair amount of testing in Australia with Telstra. So when it officially opens to what it'll be like an Xbox Insider ring. So it'll be a case of you sign up to the program, and then you can unofficially test it with your Xbox library before a broader launch. And Microsoft has a lot of Azure services in Australia already. So for those, I'd say really more on the East Coast rather than those that say in Perth and New Zealand. That's the most reliable option to actually work over the course of the next 12 months. A lot of the other services just flat out are not actually available. Stadia hasn't announced when they're going to come to Australia. PlayStation Now, Sony has a data centre in Adelaide, but they're not expanding those, and the service hasn't arrived and has had no prospect of arriving in Australia at all. And that's actually going to be super key, because there's no backward compatibility natively for, say, between the PS4 and the PS3. So when the PS5 comes out, you're going to need a service like PlayStation Now to play a lot of those old PS3 games if they haven't been already ported over to the PS4 because the architecture of that console. So really, in terms of streaming, Australians are actually quite shut out. You had other services like on Live, which were shut down, or they were just wholly restricted to the US or Europe territories.
So we mentioned Google's Stadia a little earlier, and I've seen a lot of reporting suggesting that GeForce Now is kind of a bit of a death knell for Stadia. Do you think there's a lot of validity in that idea?
Well, I think the one that people are forgetting is that Amazon are also working on their own venture in the background too. And they're, out of the three that can actually make this work, it's going to be the three that have the cloud service, the cloud infrastructure to actually power all of the data. But that may not arrive for a year or so. It's mostly just sort of talks under the table, sort of rumors, little reports popping up on Bloomberg and things like that. So in terms of data, or rather in value, that's always been Stadia's problem, because their argument is access the games you want anywhere, but you're not accessing it from a library that you've already purchased games from. You've got to buy into a whole separate library, and you don't get a whole lot for either the free or the most expensive tier for Google Stadia. Games on Stadia Pro have arrived 1 month and then literally left the next, and we're not talking about a library that has especially great exclusives or anything like that. We're talking about games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, which have been out for years. So for a lot of people, Stadia Pro is a service that not only is it expensive and not offering any value on top of what people already have, Stadia themselves have been very quiet. It's been out for almost 3 months now. There's been very few updates. There's not been any announcement on what the future roadmap for 2020 is going to look like. There's not been any sort of announcement on what territories are going to get Stadia over the next year. And when you compare that to, say, Nvidia's service that says, hey, we're only in Europe and North America right now, but they're the 2 largest regions. And if you want to have it try it for free, you can try any of the games that you currently already own. Go for it. It just shows what people thought Google was going to offer beforehand. And it's going to take Google offering something similarly priced, some kind of get in, give this a go for a little bit, because right now nobody really wants to touch Stadia, especially in countries like Australia where we have so many question marks over our infrastructure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
No, not a problem. Thanks so much for having me on.
And after I chatted to Alex at Google's celebration for the 15th anniversary of Google Maps, I caught up with Jason Murray from Osdroid to talk about where Google Maps has been and indeed where it's going in 2020 and beyond. So one of the milestones passed this week was the 15th anniversary of Google Maps, and I'm joined by Jason Murray from Osdroid. I've got to say, Jason, Google Maps is probably, outside of search, the Google product I use the most by far.
Definitely. Yeah.
Why is it so significant?
I think the significance of Maps is actually how much it's expanded to accommodate how much we do in our everyday lives. I look at Maps. I don't necessarily look at Maps for directions. I look at Maps every morning to find out how long away my bus is. The commute and the transit directions, for me, that's one of the things that really has got me using Maps more and more. And so Google's constantly adding things like this to your basic mapping product. We just heard from Noel, one of the founders of Google Maps here in Australia, because it was in fact made in Australia, that they're adding new transit information. So they're adding some attributes like whether there's a quiet carriage, whether there's a women-only carriage, even down to the fact of whether or not the fact that there's a women's only carriage is respected on Google Maps. So when you look to see when your next train is arriving, you're going to start seeing this kind of information pop up. Some of those less so for Sydney, but for other things like whether or not your train is crowded, whether or not your bus is crowded or likely to be crowded. I find the constant expansion of things that Google Maps does is just astonishing. I find restaurant reviews in there now. When I'm looking for a place to eat in a new location, I don't go for Yelp, I don't go for Foursquare or anything like that. I go for Google Maps.
Yeah, well, having just been in Tokyo, where in fact women's carriages are a big thing, they're a very large part of that transit story. It does become that kind of guide and useful thing, especially though on mobile, although, as I was saying, it didn't actually start that way. It started in very much a desktop-centric world.
It very much did. One of the things I thought was interesting today was that they were so focused on updates for the mobile app that when someone asked, I think it was yourself, asked if there's going to be any updates. Yeah, if there's going to be any updates to the desktop app, there was sort of like awkward looking at the floor and shuffling of feet, and they're like, not really. Which is quite interesting, really, because the desktop version of Maps kind of is in kind of desperate need of an update. And remember a few years ago, this was one of the focuses of Google I/O, was their massive desktop update for Maps. Maybe this is something we'll see at Google I/O this year, like their brand new Maps on desktop. We'll see. It does look pretty out of line with other Google products at the moment.
So one of the other big things, of course, is Google puts a lot of work into Maps, but actually one of the things that they highlighted is so much of this information is actually provided for free by people who do not work for Google, who don't really financially benefit from it either.
Yeah, Google's done very well to build their local guides program, and some of the local guides stuff even sort of grows out of the thing that we agreed not to mention before the interview in Google Plus, because Google Plus was actually responsible for a lot of great Google products. So Google Photos grew out of it, and Google Maps local guides. Try saying that 10 times fast. That's sort of grown out of some of the business reviews and the business listings that used to be a part of Google Plus. So Google told us that they've got 120 million local guides members, and you sort of think maybe those used to be Google Plus profiles, and they're getting 20 million contributions a day. Now, figuring out which contributions to keep and which contributions to throw out, like we can look at, like you might look at your mailbox, and we might get 20 or 30 emails a day, and we might figure out which ones to delete just sort of by looking at them. Imagine doing that to 20 million just pieces of information. It might be a new road, it might be a new shop, it might be a fixing of a phone number, it might be an addition of a website URL, it might be a change to opening hours. Figuring out which ones to keep in and which ones to filter out, it can be a pretty astonishing task.
I think Google can probably afford a few servers, a little bit of processor time for this kind of stuff relative to you and I.
Yeah, I think so. I was experimenting with some development container deployments on the weekend. I was like, oh, that's going to cost me too much.
If only you were Google.
If only I was. And there's just like, oh, there's a server in the cupboard that you can use. Yeah, I'm sure that's how it works, right?
They also talked a little bit about some of the upcoming changes to Google Maps. Again, as you said, they're basically for mobile. There's kind of layout, and there's new live view stuff, although I didn't quite get what they were getting at with new live view content. It seemed to be like live view that's already there.
Yeah, look, serious question. Have you ever used live view navigation?
Yeah, I have.
Really? I haven't.
So this is a quick little tip actually for the listeners. The single best thing that I worked out for live view, because I don't want to walk around an unfamiliar place making it blindingly obvious that I don't know where I'm going. That feels a little unsafe to me. But the big thing that I worked out that live view is really, really good for, if you've ever exited from being in a building or underground or whatever, and you fire up Google Maps to work out where you're going, quite often because of the way GPS works, you don't know if you're meant to go left or right. It can be really, really hard to work out. Live view is great for that. You flick live view up, you get it to scan the buildings, and it will tell you the direction you should be walking is this way. It's saved me so many times from walking like 1 or 2 blocks the wrong way before the map suddenly works out, no, wait, you're meant to go back that way, which is, that in itself is super useful. I don't use it, I must admit, for actually getting fully from point A to point B.
No, so I was saying to one of our Google hosts earlier that I don't use live view navigation, and I sort of put that down to the fact that I used to be a massive Ingress player, and I'm used to finding my way around just by looking at a top-down navigation on the map. I think I'm pretty good at navigation, so I kind of don't need the live view myself. So what I think they told us that they're adding today, and like I said, I don't use live view, so I don't necessarily know what's old or what's new, was the distance marker to show where your destination actually is and how far away it is, just in case you lose a little bit of faith in the directions. Like maybe it's going to send you down a street to the left so that you can go right, but so you know where you're heading eventually, rather than just heading down the streets. The one thing I do think is cute with the live view navigation though is just when you're looking at it on your device, just the giant wayfinding arrows. Like go down this street, don't go down that one. I think it's really cute. I also think
it's sort of what bothers me about it, though. It's that safety and security aspect. If I'm wandering around an unfamiliar city where I might not necessarily feel safe, having something in your hand which has a big, obvious glowing arrow feels a lot less subtle to me, and therefore, and maybe that's my own, security worries, but.
I think you're right. Like I wouldn't want to walk around an unfamiliar place just like holding my phone out in front of me. Although increasingly this is a thing, right? Like I see people walking past the building that we're sitting in, just like carrying their phones out front, talking to people on FaceTime. So maybe you wouldn't stand out as much like a tourist anymore if you're doing this. I don't know.
Possibly. So what else is actually new coming to Google Maps that they've told us about?
So they spent a bit of time today talking to us about the new tab navigation in the mobile app. So that's on iOS and on Android. There's now 5 tabs that sit at the bottom of the screen. The interesting thing is that they talked about it as if it's stuff that's coming out, but it's actually been hitting Maps apps around the world for a couple of months now. I've had the new tab layout, I think, since early January, maybe late December. And so it's another attempt to sort of organize the navigation of the application, put the most used things where they belong. So one of the most used things in Maps is looking to explore the area that you're in or the locality around you. And so that is now the first tab. It's the Explore tab. I use the Commute tab a lot, and I'm sure that there was an option in Google Maps a couple of versions ago to make the Commute tab default if it was a particular time of day where they thought that you might need the commute tab. I haven't seen it, but like it's not that difficult.
But come on, you're a developer. You should know full well. If you don't actually force users to do something, they won't change anything.
Absolutely.
They won't look into those details.
No, and that's why that option was so surprising to me. I was like, oh, that's actually really good attention to detail. I think it's gone, but that's okay. Like, Maps also gives you notifications for your transit times now. So these new tabs along the bottom, like they're arranged in sort of in the order in which they expect you to do things, and one of the new things that you can do now is that you can subscribe to updates from your favorite businesses. So if there's a cafe that you really like, you can follow them, and if they publish something on their feed that says, hey, 10% off if you come in wearing a red hat today, that'll appear in your updates tab, and you'll know that you can go see things at that cafe.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Jason.
You are very welcome. It's always nice to see you, and it's always nice to see you in person as well. As we're sitting here in the Google headquarters.
It's a rarity. Now, if people want to catch up with your writing work, where can they do that?
You can find me on ausdroid.net. That's ausdroid.net, and you can follow me on Twitter at jm77.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks again to Alex and Jason for making time for the show this week. If you've got some feedback for them or for us, you can catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. We really appreciate your shout outs, your feedback, reviews. Keep them coming. Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by Casa Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market.
I'm innocent, I tell you.